First and foremost, shout out to all my conspiracy theorists out there. Like, I know back in the day when it felt like you were the only one and you were out there on that island alone, but it's a lot more conspiracy theories today, aren't there? That should make you go, wonder why. You know, but we're going to leave that alone and get into the next video, all right? Remember, man, these videos will make you question everything. So remember, this is for entertainment purposes only. Let's check them out.
A lot of the most disturbing coincidences can seem like curses. Whether you believe that these strange events were just the result of luck or something supernatural, there's definitely something creepy about them. Number 10. A series of eerie coincidences combined with an already controversial movie to create the impression of a curse that had gripped the 2004 movie The Passion of the Christ. There are plenty of horror films that are rumored to be cursed. The creepy and paranormal circumstances of these films are said to seep out into the real world. But possibly the only kind of film, more likely than horror films to be accused of being cursed, is films with religious connections. The Passion was primed for stories of curses. Almost as soon as the film was announced, it was surrounded by controversy. The film would tell the story of the final days of its titular character, drawing on biblical and extra-biblical sources. That attracted outrage from both religious and secular individuals. It was also extremely violent. When it was finally released, it said that some of the worst scenes caused heart attacks in at least 2 people. Director Mel Gibson called the film a potential career ender and encouraged lead actor Jim Caviezel to reconsider taking the role. Caviezel didn't take the advice and was rewarded with an extremely punishing shoot. There are many disturbing stories about wounds that Caviezel suffered while on set. Some were caused by another actor with bad aim, while another came when the 150-pound wooden cross fell on him. These could hardly be considered part of some curse. Accidents will happen on most sets, and both have pretty mundane explanations.
Yeah, but this ain't most sets. Would y'all have done it? Taking on this role? I don't know if I could have done it. I might not have felt like I could have done it justice. You know, forget all of the controversy and different things. I just don't think I could have done it justice. That's a role to play, bro. And to really go there, like to be what they call him, I guess, a method actor in this type of situation. And when you have somebody like, I think he said Mel Gibson, telling him this was a career ender, like, that's a tough one, man. And y'all know I still have yet to see Passion of the Christ, right? Yeah, I just could never bring myself to do it.
It wasn't only wounds that Caviezel suffered, though. Filming in the winter in Italy led to him almost suffering from hypothermia and catching pneumonia at one point. The heavy makeup also led to him suffering from migraines. But the creepiest events that happened on set were a series of lightning strikes that hit the set during filming. The final day of filming involved Caviezel in the Sermon on the Mount scene. During the 5th take of the scene, as the camera panned through the scenery, Caviezel was struck by a bolt of lightning. By the time the camera reached him, the lightning had disappeared, but Caviezel was left with his hair alight and smoke pouring from his ears. Luckily, he managed to survive the attack, but he was left with heart problems that persisted for over a decade. As the crew tried to make sure their lead actor was all right after the unexpected strike, another bolt of lightning came down. This time, it hit assistant director Jan Michelini. It was the 2nd time that Michelini had been struck by lightning during the shoot. Earlier in production, he'd been standing with an umbrella when a bolt of lightning struck it, causing burns on his fingertips. Michelini was also lucky to survive both lightning strikes and managed to get through the final day of shooting without attracting any more bolts. For some, this eerie set of coincidences, combined with the other accidents on set, have left them convinced that the film was cursed. A bolt of lightning would be a thematic way for such a curse to manifest itself. But the coincidences seem a little less eerie when considering the filming location. The location for the Sermon on the Mount scene is known for its stormy weather. The Passion might have had more accidents than a typical movie set, but they were much more likely to have been just coincidental accidents than the result of some strange curse. The movie went on to become a box office success, though it did appear to have a negative impact on Caviezel's career. Number 9. There have been many instances of simultaneous discovery or inventions throughout history. Most of the time, these are simply strange coincidences, though there have been instances where one piece of work had unknowingly influenced creators to simultaneously make the same thing. For the most part, these simultaneous inventions are noted as strange quirks and nothing more. Other times, it can expand into an international controversy, as was the case with the invention or discovery of calculus. What we know about calculus today is that it was first invented by Isaac Newton in roughly 1666. It was a time period when disease forced people into isolation, and Newton dedicated his time to trying to understand the scientific laws that are fundamental to our universe. To better understand concepts such as gravity and geometry, Newton created a new way to calculate the area under a curve and related concepts. He called it fluxional calculus. But Newton was notorious for not publishing his work. There was always more that would be discovered, changed, or edited in his manuscripts. That meant that it would be decades before his full works on calculus were ever published to the wider world. In the meantime, he continued to develop his ideas in other ways. On occasion, the calculus would be mentioned in his published work on other subjects, with only a short explanation of what it was in relation to the topic at hand. If someone were following Newton's work closely, they might notice that there was something Newton had developed behind the scenes, but it would be impossible to figure out exactly what. Newton's ideas of calculus also showed up in private correspondence with other mathematicians. He didn't go into details about his invention, but did encode secret messages about what he called fluxions in later letters. He believed that this would serve as proof that he was the one to come up with these ideas first, even if he didn't publish them, and even though the recipient of the letter would have no idea what the codes meant. One of the people who received one of these letters was German mathematician and philosopher Gottfried Leibniz. Leibniz came to mathematics later in life. He'd previously worked on law, metaphysics, politics, and philosophy. It wasn't until meeting mathematician Christian Huygens in 1672 that he decided to turn his hand to the subject. For Leibniz, inventing calculus was a way of solving something called the tangent problem. He came at the problem from a different direction to Newton, but ultimately came up with the same idea. Leibniz also came up with a notation system which was useful and consistent. Leibniz would be the first to publish his ideas, with Newton following closely after. Even though Newton had come up with calculus decades before Leibniz, it's still considered a simultaneous invention, as neither would have been able to influence the other's discoveries. At first, the two were happy to accept the fact that they both coincidentally invented the same thing. But over the following years, a bitter dispute would take place.
I know a lot of people that aren't happy that y'all came up with this difficult mathematics stuff, man. Oh, bro. Even though I love math and I loved all of this, I sat in class with some people who were upset that we were doing this. Y'all remember the ones? Like, when am I going to use this in life? They would shout that out in class and stuff like that and be mad and upset. Bro, if they could go back in time and holler at these two gentlemen, they would.
It started with supporters on both sides accusing the other of plagiarism. Then Newton and Leibniz began to weigh in on the matter. The Royal Society of London decided to investigate the matter in 1712, with the committee selected to look into both claims. Newton himself wasn't on the committee, but he was head of the Royal Society of London, and it would have been a surprise to anybody when the society found in his favor. Even though at the time Leibniz seemed to be discredited, we know today that he did independently invent calculus. He'd received the coded letter from Newton, but had no idea what the message was. It was only down to coincidence and the fact that both men were surrounded by the same ideas, that they came up with the same mathematical systems. Today, Newton is recognized as the first inventor, but it's Leibniz notations that are more often used. Number 8. On September 30th, 1955, James Dean was driving down California State Route 46 when he was involved in a horrifying car accident that claimed his life. A set of creepy coincidences has made the crash and the car involved infamous. A week earlier, on September 23rd, Dean took delivery of the car. It was only a few years earlier that Dean's racing career had taken off. While he was filming his most famous movies, he appeared at car racing events for novices. Dean appeared to be a natural, placing highly in the events that he finished. He was also known for being a little reckless and often made contact with other cars when he raced. That alone wouldn't have made him stand out too much in a field of amateur racers. Dean wanted a faster car, though. On September 21st, 1955, he traded in the Porsche 356 Super Speedster that he'd owned for just a few months and used the money to purchase a brand new 550 Spider. On September 23rd, the car was sat in the courtyard of a packed restaurant in Hollywood where Dean was eating. It was still wrapped in cellophane, with a bouquet of roses tied to the bonnet. Dean hadn't had a chance to drive it yet, but it was already entered in a race that would take place over the October 1st and 2nd weekend. In a story told by actor Alec Guinness, Dean spotted Guinness being turned away from the restaurant and invited him in to come join them at his table. Guinness was already a well-known actor by 1955, and Dean seemed eager to have his company. He also wanted to show off his car. Guinness later told BBC's Michael Parkinson that a strange feeling came over him when he saw the car. He asked a few questions about it, then told Dean not to get into it. Guinness looked at his watch and warned him that if he got in that car, he wouldn't be alive by that time next week. Dean laughed off the comment and they continued their evening. The original plan had been for the car to be placed in a trailer and driven down to Salinas for the racing event. But the engine of the Spider was known for being difficult if it hadn't been broken in properly. Dean had hired Porsche mechanic Rolf Wutherick to help prepare the car for the event, and he suggested they drive it down to Salinas to get some more miles on and run the engine. So on the afternoon of September 30th, Dean and Wutherick got into the car to begin the journey south. Friend and stuntman Bill Hickman drove the trailer behind them. During the journey, Dean was testing just what the Spider could do, and was actually pulled over for speeding at one point. But unfortunately, that didn't slow him down. Just 2 hours later, at approximately 5:45 p.m., Dean crashed with another vehicle almost head-on. Dean is believed to have passed away instantly. Wutherick was thrown from the car but survived. The person they crashed into also survived. The car was completely written off but was purchased by another amateur racing driver, Dr. William Eschrick, from a junkyard. It was taken apart and the engine placed in Eschrick's Lotus. The legend surrounding Dean's car is that it cost the lives of many other people after parts were placed in different vehicles. Eschrick was involved in a crash while carrying the Spider's engine, but it was only a minor incident. But another racer wasn't so lucky. Troy McHenry had borrowed the transmission and suspension parts from Eschrick and fit them to his own car. He collided with a tree in a 1956 Pomona sports car race and passed away.
Who designed these parts for this car, bro? Like, at this point, I wouldn't want nothing to do with any part of it. From the steering wheel, to the engine, to the tires, to the lug nuts, to nothing. I don't even want the paint job. Like, how does that even, like, I'm so thrown off by this and confused, fam. Like, I guess that's why we have like a recall system today.
The incident started rumors of a curse that surrounded the car, although it was nothing more than a tragic coincidence. The other incidents that are alleged to have taken place, including multiple mechanics receiving wounds after pieces of the car fell on them, were likely made up by a promoter, hoping to raise the notoriety of the machine. Today, the location of the 550 Spider is a mystery. It was likely scrapped long ago, but there's a chance the wreck was hidden away somewhere and could still be uncovered.
I venture to say it's still out there somewhere and that somebody didn't destroy it. Especially with it being his car, the history, the connection to who is connected to what happened. I just hope somebody ain't dumb enough to be out here trying to restore it and use some of the old parts of it, fam. Like, you can call that a coincidence if you want to, but that's too many coincidences.
Number 7. Few films have had as many strange and creepy coincidences take place during production as the horror classic The Exorcist. Stories of strange occurrences on set led to rumors of a curse, which only added to the fear that surrounded the already terrifying movie. Since the film was released, cast members have dismissed stories of a curse, insisting that the eerie events were just coincidences. But that doesn't take away from just how creepy they were. The strange coincidences began before filming for the movie even started. The majority of the film takes place in the home of the McNeil family. While the exterior scenes were shot in Washington, the interior sets were located at a studio in New York. Before filming began, a bird flew into the circuit breaker at the location, starting a fire that tore through the sets. The only set that was spared was the one for Reagan's room, where the exorcism would be filmed. Filming was delayed as sets were rebuilt, and then further delayed as close family members of two actors passed away. More delays happened when a statue that was supposed to be shipped to a filming location in Iraq was accidentally shipped to Hong Kong instead. Things didn't improve when filming actually got underway. A number of cast and crew members suffered accidents. A carpenter lost his thumb, and a lighting technician lost a toe in separate incidents. But the most famous of the creepy accidents involved actresses Linda Blair and Ellen Burstyn, who played Reagan and her mother Chris respectively. Both characters are thrown about by demonic forces during the possession, which was achieved mostly through practical effects. During a scene where Reagan's bed is being tossed around, Blair was supposed to be strapped down to prevent injury, but the straps were too loose, causing her to be thrown about in the bed. She suffered damage to her lower spine, which resulted in her developing scoliosis later in life. Something similar happened to Burstyn in a scene where her character was supposed to be thrown backwards by the demonic entity. This was
Who's the responsible person that just comes through and just like, man, I know we got a lot of money invested, but before we get all these lawsuits coming in and someone lose their life or something like that, we need to shut this down. This is just not going good, and maybe it's not meant for us to shoot this movie. Bro, this is way too much happening right now. Who's that person? Or is there that person on a movie set? Like, if not, they need some type of consultant or somebody.
Achieved by a harness which would pull the actress back. And during one take, an accident resulted in damage to Burstyn's lower back, and she spent the rest of the production on crutches. The setback, delays, and various problems led to filming going drastically over budget and taking twice as long as scheduled. Considering the production time, it's understandable why some of these strange coincidences occur. Those who believe in a supposed curse point to the number of people closely related to cast and crew members who passed away during filming. While many would have been shocking and unexpected passings individually, there doesn't seem to be any exceptionally high number of passings connected to the movie. Other eerie coincidences are less easy to brush aside. For example, when the film premiered in Rome, the promoters deliberately chose a venue with a religious setting, opposite of an old church. During the premiere, a bolt of lightning hit the spire of the church, resulting in the cross on top briefly catching fire. It would be easy to interpret the event as a dark sign, even though it was simply a creepy coincidence. Over half a century since the film was released, it remains one of the creepiest and most influential horror films in history. Whether a curse or simply a series of strange coincidences, the events that happened on set have only added to the mystique surrounding it. Number 6. Abraham Lincoln's political career coincided with the rise of the popularity of photography. Over 130 photographs of the president were taken, and he was one of the most photographed people of the time. The vast majority of these photographs were portraits. It was much harder to take photographs out in the field, and these only make up a small portion of the catalog of Lincoln photos. This makes it even more unusual that 2 Lincoln photographs also capture the image of people who wouldn't be famous until later. In April of 1865, days before he took the life of the president, John Wilkes Booth told a friend that he had the perfect opportunity to carry out the act months earlier. He'd been at Lincoln's second inauguration and told friend Sam Chester that he had an excellent opportunity to take Lincoln's life if he wanted to. Roughly 50,000 people gathered in Washington to hear Lincoln speak at his second inauguration. Among those was Alexander Gardner, who took many photos of Lincoln throughout the president's career. He captured many photographs at the inauguration, including photos of the crowd and Lincoln before and during his speech. The most famous of the inauguration photos was taken by Gardner. Sometimes it's described as the only one believed to exist, even though that isn't true. In the photo, Lincoln is giving his address, surrounded by hundreds of people behind him, above him, and below him. He's a small figure and would be hard to make out if it wasn't for the fact that almost everyone else in the photo is turned to look at him. Even harder to make out in the picture is an actor partially obscured by two men in front of him. John Wilkes Booth hadn't been exaggerating when he said he'd had an excellent opportunity. In the photo, Booth's hat and the top of his head can just be seen. Directly above Lincoln, there's a bearded man on the balcony, pressed up against the railings. Beside him stands another man, his hand cupped to his ear to better hear the address. The two men's top hats partially obscure the face of another man, believed to be Booth himself. This isn't the only photograph of Booth, and it isn't the best one. Historian and photograph collector Frederick Hill Meserve used another photograph from the event to identify Booth as the individual. This photograph is rarely reprinted, as a smudge obscures the president's face. But on the balcony, behind the bearded man and next to a statue is Booth, his face clear as possible in such an old photograph. Another photo, this time collected by Richard and Katie Gutman, shows Booth very clearly. In this picture, the president is out of focus, but the crowd behind and above him is much clearer. Booth looks down at the president in a strikingly eerie photo, considering what would happen just a few months later. Another eerie coincidence can be seen in a photograph taken from Lincoln's funeral procession. Historians noticed that one of the buildings in the street was a house owned by Cornelius Van Schack Roosevelt, grandfather of future President Theodore Roosevelt. Looking at one of the windows of the building, two small faces can be seen peering out at the procession below. Theodore Roosevelt's wife was asked about the image and confirmed that the two people seen in the photograph were the future president and his brother Elliot. Number 5. More than 1,100 sailors lost their lives during the First Battle of Savo Island, a World War II battle that took place in April of 1942. Among those to survive the encounter was a Navy seaman, Elgin Staples. Staples would make headlines after returning home due to a small coincidence that featured in his rescue. Navy signalman 3rd Class Elgin Staples was working aboard the USS Astoria on the night of August 8th. The ship had arrived off the coast of Guadalcanal the day before and had been supporting the Marine landings. The sailors had already defended the mission from enemy attacks once, and everybody would have been ready to see more fighting. The Japanese forces used the cover of darkness to slip back into the area after retreating, then launched an attack on the Astoria and other Allied ships. Astoria fought back, but enemy fire tore through the ship. A particularly nasty blast sent many men overboard, including Staples. Staples had already had the forethought to put on a rubber life belt, which kept him afloat in the warm waters. It would take hours before Staples was rescued. In that time, he tried to remain calm while treading water. He was suffering from wounds to his legs from shrapnel but was otherwise unharmed. Staples could feel things brushing up against his legs, and then a ship in the distance started to fire bullets into the water around him. It wasn't until later that he realized the ship was actually an Allied vessel, and the sailors were aiming for the sharks to keep them away.
Yeah, I had to suspect they were shooting at the sharks because then they say he had shrapnel and stuff, so he was probably bleeding, which was probably like attracting sharks from all over the area. I can only imagine, man. They were just talking about that like recently with a guy who jumped off a cruise ship or something like that. Fell off, jumped off something. And he had to tread water for a while. And it was dark and he just kept feeling things swimming past him, bro.
After being rescued, Staples was sent back to the Astoria to try and help rescue the ship. The sailors aboard were trying to beach the ship in the shallow waters, but it was too badly damaged. A fire aboard the vessel caused it to sink, and Staples once again entered the water. Thankfully, he was still wearing the rubber belt. 200 sailors who'd been aboard the Astoria lost their lives that night, but Staples wasn't one of them. After being rescued a second time, Staples got the chance to examine the belt he was wearing. He was surprised to learn that it had coincidentally been manufactured in a factory in Staples' hometown of Akron, Ohio. Staples got medical leave and returned to Akron to visit his mother. He recounted the story of his harrowing survival. Vera Mueller-Staples revealed that she'd been trying to do her part in the war effort and was working at the Firestone Tire and Rubber Factory. Hearing that, Staples brought out the life belt that had saved his life. He pointed out the strange coincidence. His mother was amazed at the sight. The story made local newspaper headlines at the time, and Vera revealed that she was an inspector at the plant. She claimed that there was a 1 in 3 chance that the belt had passed through her hands before being sent off to the Navy and eventually being wrapped around her son. In a later version of the story told by Elgin Staples, Vera told him that the serial number on the belt was actually her inspector number, confirming that she had been the one to inspect this particular belt. He would say that it felt as if his mother's arms had stretched across the Pacific to save him. Both Elgin and Vera survived the war and were reunited again afterward.
That's not a coincidence. That's meant to be. That was supposed to be you. It went through your mom's hands. Like, that was supposed to be for you. Period. Point blank. I'm not, no, that ain't coincidence. That was supposed to be. That was meant to be.
Vera was recognized by the War Congress of American Industry for her initiative, skill, and constructive aid in industry. Elgin achieved the rank of Seaman First Class and went on to marry and have 2 children. Number 4. The story of the Superman curse allegedly dates back to the very start of the comic book character's life. It's most commonly associated with the tragic and unfortunate events that have surrounded the actors and actresses that are associated with the character on screen. It could be nothing more than a series of coincidences, but that hasn't stopped fear of the curse from spreading every time a new actor takes on one of cinema's most famous roles. Superman was created back in 1938 by comic book artists Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. The character would go on to become the most famous superhero of all time, but neither artist got the credit they deserved. Shuster's career also took a downturn after the creation of the character, and he eventually lost his eyesight. The curse continued through cartoon artists Max and Dave Fleischer, who also had their careers irrevocably changed by the cartoon. The pair were brothers but had a falling out as they created the Superman cartoons. Max struggled to find other work after the series and passed away in poverty. The similar fates of these artists are disturbing, but it would likely be ruled as nothing more than a coincidence, were it not for the tragic events that would befall the Superman actors in the following decades. For a long time, there seemed to be 2 kinds of fate for Superman actors. TV's first Man of Steel, Kirk Alyn, suffered a similar fate to Max Fleischer. Alyn had a successful run as Superman, first portraying him in movie serials between 1948 and 1950. But after that, Alyn struggled to get roles. He played another comic book character, Black Hawk, in a 1952 film serial, but his other roles were uncredited in only small parts. Alyn found himself typecast. Even though he'd had a successful film and stage career before that, it seemed like casting directors couldn't think of him as anything but Superman. Alyn may not have had a successful career after Superman, but he did at least have his life and health. The same wouldn't be said of the next 2 actors to take the role. When Superman took to the silver screen again in 1951, Alyn turned down the role. It went instead to George Reeves. Reeves played Superman on screen for a few years, but found he ran into the same problem Alyn had. He thought that he would never be able to be seen as a serious actor again. But Reeves' story took a darker turn when his body was found in his bedroom in June of 1959. He'd suffered a bullet wound, and it seemed to be self-inflicted. But his fingerprints were never found on the weapon, and the event remains controversial to this day. The next actor to play Superman, Christopher Reeve, also met with misfortune after leaving the role behind. Reeve played the superhero between 1978 and 1987. The role kicked off Reeve's career. Unlike other actors and artists who had worked on the character, Reeve was able to find work in other roles alongside his work as Superman. Some of these performances were even nominated for awards. When he left the Man of Steel behind in 1987, it seemed like he'd avoided any curse related to the character. But unfortunately, 8 years after his final Superman movie was revealed, he was thrown off a horse in a riding accident and was left paralyzed from the neck down. Reeve continued to work as a director, writer, and actor, despite his condition. It wasn't only Superman actors that could fall victim to the strange coincidences. Supporting actors and actresses also found that their careers suffered after working with the characters. or else had trouble with their personal lives. In more recent years, the so-called curse and coincidences appear to have stopped. Number 3. War can often lead to paranoia, which means that even the smallest of coincidences can be read into. The coincidence of the Deadly Double advertisement wasn't a small one and has gripped the attention of conspiracy theorists for decades, even as the ad's creator has insisted that it was nothing more than a coincidence. The November 22, 1941 issue of the New Yorker magazine featured plenty of advertisements between the various articles. The advertisement for a dice game was a little dark, but nothing too out of the ordinary. The main advertisement featured a drawing of people in an air raid shelter, playing the dice game as searchlights appear in the sky behind them. The copy tells the reader that even if they don't want to think of the morbid possibility of war coming to American shores, they should consider what they would do if they had to spend the night in an air raid shelter. The dice game, Deadly Double, was offered as the perfect solution. Scattered around the issue were a number of smaller advertisements, which all pointed back to the main one, and it's these ads that produced so much controversy. Beneath the words was a drawing of 2 six-sided dice. Both had 3 faces visible. The numbers 12 and 7 were among the numbers visible. 2 weeks after the advertisement was published, on December 7th, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor. According to a few military sources, intelligence agencies are now convinced that the mysterious advertisement had actually been a code. 12 and 7 could refer to the month and date that the attacks would take place. 5 and 0 appeared on one die, which may have referred to the intended time of the attack. The letters XX appeared on the other side, which was believed to be a reference to the rough latitude of Pearl Harbor. Conspiracy theorists claimed that the intelligence agencies tried to find out who had placed the ads. It was believed that they'd been trying to convey a secret message to Japanese forces in the US, but the advertisement had been placed over the counter and paid for in cash. The clerk that had accepted the ad couldn't recall the person who'd placed it. It was apparently impossible to trace. Many have claimed that the story remains a mystery to this day, but it was actually solved just a few months after the mystery began. The game was a real game, produced by a man named Roger Paul Craig, and it was relatively easy for newspaper people and the FBI to track down Craig. He claimed that it was nothing more than a coincidence, and he had no idea about the Pearl Harbor attacks beforehand.
Good luck convincing him of that, buddy. Like, I don't even see how he could remotely get himself out of this one, even if he is innocent. Like, that's, yeah, good luck, buddy.
He just wanted to create a simple dice game, but it was now attached to a dark event. Even though it was just a coincidence that the advertisements became associated with Pearl Harbor, it was impossible to shake the notoriety, and the game didn't sell well. Despite being cleared up relatively soon after the event, the truth didn't reach too many people. For decades afterward, people have speculated about the advertisement and what it could have really meant, and if there was an unidentified spy at work somewhere within the US. The advertisement wouldn't have worked well as a code, though. As Craig himself said, if the advertisement had been meant as a warning, it would have been hard for any enemies to decode that message. Craig went on to work for the Office of Strategic Services during the war, the predecessor of the CIA, adding another twist to the tale. Number 2. Officially, 96 men lost their lives during the construction of the Hoover Dam. There may be many more who later passed away due to the experiences they went through, and others who didn't make it onto the official record. Many of the myths and legends that surround the fatalities of the Hoover Dam project are just stories, but one story of a strange coincidence is sadly true. On December 12, 1922, John Gregory Tierney became the first person to lose his life while working on the project. Exactly 14 years later, his son Patrick William Tierney became the last person. J.G. Tierney was a rock miner who grew up in Missouri. He traveled around the United States for work, eventually landing a job as part of a team surveying the Colorado River as part of an upcoming project. At the time, the river was completely unfettered, which meant that it was difficult to control when extreme weather came. As the survey team worked in Boulder Canyon, the river started to flood, and John was caught in the water. He wouldn't get out and was washed away. John's body was never recovered, and it took 2 weeks for the news to reach his wife. For years afterwards, any time remains were found along the banks of the Colorado River, they were checked to see if they belonged to John, but unfortunately his family would never get the chance to bury him. The Tierneys moved back to Missouri after the accident. Patrick was only 12 at the time and had to grow up without a father. By the time Patrick grew up, the Great Depression had hit, and work was hard to come by. He was an aspiring writer, but he also had a young family to support and knew that something more practical was necessary. The Hoover Dam project was one of the few places that was hiring workers. His mother was wary about him working there after what happened to his father. She'd never recovered from losing him. The work seemed to have only gotten even more dangerous since John had lost his life, with dozens of other young men losing theirs to make the desert blue. But with few other options, Patrick headed to the Black Canyon to work as an electrician's assistant on the project. On December 20th, 1935, Patrick fell from one of the intake towers into the water below. He didn't survive the fall, and it was hours later when his body was discovered. Construction finished the following year, and Patrick became the last person to pass away while working on the project. He left behind a wife and small child. They went on to live with Patrick's mother and his mother-in-law in a cabin in Oregon. What makes this coincidence so strange is the fact that Patrick had moved away from the project after his father passed away, but he was drawn back to Arizona, unable to avoid the same fate as his father.
If I'm his mom, I wouldn't even want to go nowhere near that dam. At all. Like, none of my family. At all, bro. You lost your husband and your child to that? Yeah. Don't even get me close to it.
Number 1. Between 1841 and 1963, 8 presidents of the United States of America passed away while in office. Of those, 7 were elected at 20-year intervals. It wasn't long into the chain that the strange coincidences were noticed, giving rise to a story of a curse. The coincidences began with William Henry Harrison. Harrison was elected in 1840, but spent just a month in office. He gave a lengthy inauguration speech on a cold, wet, and windy day, which only led to him catching a case of pneumonia. He spent the next 30 days sick before passing away. He was the first president to pass away in office, but he wouldn't be the last. Less than 10 years later, Zachary Taylor passed away 16 months into his term due to stomach problems. Taylor would be the outlier as the only president to pass away in office and not be elected in a year ending in the number 0. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was running for his first term as president. He of course won the election and led the nation through the most difficult period of its short life. He managed to survive his first term in office, and if he hadn't stood again, it's possible that the stories of curses would have been avoided. But famously, Lincoln did win the next election and had his life taken just months later. James Garfield was the next president to be elected in a year ending in 0, and the next to pass away in office. Garfield also met a violent end after being attacked by Charles Guiteau at a train station. 2 presidents elected 20 years apart, losing their lives in office isn't too big of a coincidence. But when it happens 3 times, the coincidence is definitely noteworthy. When the next 2 presidents to be elected in a year ending in 0 also passed away, the coincidence became too much for some people. By now, rumors of a curse had been spread and was published in an edition of Ripley's Believe It or Not. According to the story, this wasn't a coincidence, but the consequences of actions taken by the person at the start of the chain. Before he was elected president, Harrison had served as governor of the Indiana Territory. He negotiated a deal with the Native Americans already living there, which turned over more land to the United States. That led to the Battle of Tippecanoe, where Native tribes tried to attack Harrison's army. The U.S. troops won the battle, and the Shawnee leader Tecumseh lost his life. Tecumseh's brother was also known as the Prophet. He allegedly cursed Harrison and those who would come after him. Whether this was an actual curse or simply a prediction is impossible to determine. The story of the curse was likely fictional, but the 20-year coincidences continued to happen. After Garfield, William McKinley and Warren Harding both passed away while in office. The curse took a longer time to strike the next president in the chain, Franklin Roosevelt. He was elected to his 3rd term in 1940, but it wouldn't be until after the start of his 4th term that he passed away due to a cerebral hemorrhage. The final president to be connected to the chain of coincidences was John F. Kennedy. who was elected in 1960 and had his life taken 3 years later. In 1981, it looked as if the curse was still in full swing. Ronald Reagan had been elected the year before. He was leaving a speaking engagement when John Hinckley Jr. opened fire on him. Despite being struck by a bullet, Reagan managed to survive the attempt on his life and went on to serve a second term without issue. For some, this was Reagan breaking the curse. No other president has passed away in office, and it would seem the curse, or chain of coincidences, has finally stopped.